Thank you so much for that wonderful welcome, Patty, and thank you for the welcome I'm feeling from everyone here. It was rather rude to make me cry right before I spoke, though. I have a small resentment about that. I'm serious. That was a moment right there, wasn't it? Can we have another round of love for that beautiful music? Thank you so much, all of you. Oh my gosh. I thought it might be worthwhile to come in here today and speak with you a little bit about a good old religious word called sin. It's not a word you hear a lot in New Thought, in vision centers, or in unity churches, or religious science churches, or Unitarian churches, or any of these wonderful folks. Really don't talk much about sin anymore. It used to be kind of a big deal in the Christian world, you know? I used to use it a lot. Kind of threaten people with hellfire, you know, and then pass the basket. So we have a different way now of doing that. But I just thought it was so interesting because the word is still really prevalent in the world. Not so much around here, but in the world, it sure is, right? So I hope that maybe in the next few minutes we can think a little bit more deeply into this ancient idea, get some clarity about what role it has in our life, if any. And maybe we don't need the word, maybe we don't need the idea at all, so that's why I call this talk The End of Sin. So when we walk out of here a little later, we can just sort of let it go. But I wanted to start with an ancient source, a classic source, and then trace the dialogue back to its wellspring, which is really the New Testament. And those of you who've heard me speak before or read any of my writings know that I don't often quote the Bible. I'm usually quoting the Upanishads or the Dhammapada or the Bhagavad Gita or the Tao Te Ching or Thoreau or the Simpsons or something like that. But there are some there's this really interesting tension between two visions of sin, Jesus and Paul. And as you know, the New Testament is about Jesus, but half of it is written by Paul, who is the first great apostle whose many letters, over a dozen letters, form over half of the New Testament. So his voice is a singular authority, and he has some interesting things to say about sin that I want to contrast with what Jesus has to say about sin, and maybe we can kind of see if there's something there in that tension that will open something up for us and maybe illuminate our own understanding of this charged idea of sin. You know, Jesus and Paul never met, as far as we know. Although they were contemporaries, they were born 8 years apart. Paul was 8 years younger. And what I think is remarkable is that Paul never had the opportunity of meeting Jesus, being in his presence, or hearing him speak. And yet Paul becomes the authority of what Jesus meant and what Jesus was. And Paul became a follower of the fledgling Jesus movement, of course, and known simply in those first few years as the Way. The word Christianity or Christonoi in Greek wouldn't come up for another 100 years. So these were just a bunch of mostly Jews who were following this Rabbi Jesus and his sayings after his death, and they called each other followers of the Way. And yet it is Paul's understanding, or may I be so bold, maybe misunderstanding, of Jesus and sin that kind of came down and became the official church teaching that shaped Christianity more than any other source. In fact, we speak in religious studies of Christianity as Pauline Christianity. So deeply is his mark felt in traditional Christian teaching, doctrine, and orthodoxy. And so 400 years after Paul and Jesus, of course, Paul's letters were canonized or made official by the Roman Church and inserted into the New Testament, along with the four Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, and the book called Revelation. So that's the New Testament, right? And it's kind of a big deal. And so let's think about how that all came together. Now, another layer of confusion is we're dealing in English here. We're speaking English today. And that's not the language of Jesus, and it's not the language of the New Testament. We all know that Jesus spoke Aramaic. The New Testament was written in Greek and by its authors, and Greek was the language most often used by authors in that time. And so our English word sin, S-I-N, comes from an Old English word, sin, spelled S-Y-N-N. I don't see anybody taking notes. This is all going to be on the exam, you know. No, just kidding. Just kind of, I don't mean to get into all this like academic stuff right now, but it's kind of interesting to trace these words, right? So our English word sin is based on an Old English word sin, S-Y-N-N, which meant missing the mark. It was an archery term. I know a lot of you have heard this before. So that's the English etymology or root word origin. Sin is an archery term. When the arrow hits the dirt below the target, that's missing the mark. Now, that Old English word is their best attempt to render an Old Greek word, and again, the Old Testament was written in Greek. That Old Greek word is hamartia, and hamartia means internal flaw. That's the Aramaic word. And for example, as that came into Greek, it kind of retained its same spelling, and it meant in Greek and in Aramaic, it meant an internal flaw, like a downfall, that thing that messes you up. Usually hubris, excessive self-pride. So all the Greek tragedies are kind of about that, right? The main character has this internal flaw, usually hubris, that ends up wrecking their entire life. So that's where the word hamartia comes from. It's the hero's lack of humility, the hero's lack of faith, the hero's lack of compassion, and his mistaken belief that he can control everything with his ego. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, that's why these old Greek tragedies still resonate pretty well. So this notion, this early notion of sin is deeply interesting to us because it hits very close to home. And the word that Jesus used in Aramaic seems to, that gets translated as hamartia in the Greek New Testament, that gets translated as sin. The word that Jesus used, he borrowed from the business world, really. It had to do with owing money. It had to do with debt, being in debt to someone else. So there's a lot going on with this little word of sin, all these different elements and roots. Now, I'll go out on a limb here and guess that everyone in this room has struggled in one way or another with this dynamic and been frustrated by the way that our lives fall short of the ideal and the way that our intentions, miss the mark, and the way that our tangled webs drag us into places that we really didn't want to go and ensnare us in behaviors that no longer serve our highest good. I think we all know what all of that means. And the way the same old mistakes just keep happening again and again and again. And some of us have watched through the years how, as our appetites slowly grew and insidiously leaped over their bounds until they consumed us. Some of us had unmet needs that we didn't dare acknowledge and were deeply submerged. Those feelings of shame and unworthiness and completely irrational rationalizations that fueled destructive behaviors, that threatened to tear down everything that we loved and everything we worked so long and hard to create. Our businesses, our marriages, our sanity. And for some of us, these realizations came too late, and we did lose everything. And we had to begin again. So this business of sin is no joke. And so what is this sin thing? What is this internal flaw, this destructive strain? And more importantly, and let's get practical, how do we repair it? How do we really grow into our best life and start over and recover our original goodness? That's the most interesting piece. How do we climb out of the hole, get back on level ground where we are no better and no worse than anyone else? And how do we restore our original status as beings of infinite value and lay bare the lie of our unworthiness? How do we do all that? How do we find the light and watch the lie wither away? You know the old saying, when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. And let go of the shovel, right? But then what? Now, Stephen Mitchell has a wonderful book called The Gospel According to Jesus. I recommend it. It's a beautiful little piece. And here's what Stephen Mitchell says about Paul. For Paul, the moral life is difficult, muscular, and perilous. End quote. We have to constantly be vigilant, Paul says, because the flesh is weak. And when you look at Paul's language, he seems to be locked in a kind of a death struggle with the demon sin. Paul gives us a very violent portrait of the human predicament, that we are at war with ourselves, that there is a war within. And he says, quote, "Nothing good lives in me." Paul's not much of a New Thought guy, really. He says that there is a cancer in us called, quote, "our sinful nature." And a power so great that we cannot overcome it with our will. In his letter to the Romans, 7:21, for those of you that are going to look all this up later, Paul says, "So I find this law at work. When I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in the members of my body." Members meaning like my hands and all my limbs, my extremities, and different organs. This organ wants that, this organ wants this. He talks a lot about members. And I'll let you go where you want to go with that. "So I see another law at work in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind, which loves God, and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work in my own members. What a wretched man am I." Let's work that into a hymn maybe for next time. What a wretched man am I. No, it's so amazing, isn't it, how, Freud is going to have a field day with Paul later, of course. This self-loathing is just huge. And then he says, "Who will rescue me from this body of death?" So there's a bit of desperation in Paul's frustration with his own inability to get on top of his compulsive, destructive behaviors. And you can feel it, can't you? 2,000 years of Christian doctrine rooted in this sentiment. That there is a deep duality between good and evil, and that the battlefield is right here in our body. Onward, Christian soldier, marching as to war, all that martial Christianity. The language of struggle, violence, self-loathing, and war permeate Paul's portrait of the human condition. Now let's turn to Jesus and see what he has to say about these same dynamics. What does Jesus say about sin? Well, in the Gospel of Matthew 11:28, Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in my heart, and you will find rest for your souls." And then one of the greatest lines in all of the New Testament, right? "For my yoke is easy and my burden light." What a radically different message from Paul. My yoke is easy and my burden light. Now, some of you are aware, of course, that the word yoga from Sanskrit is etymologically linked to the word yoke in English. A yoke is a farm implement that you put on a couple of oxen or something to channel the energy of these wonderful animals to do work toward a goal. And yoga is also the discipline of integrating the energies of our consciousness toward a specific aim, namely illumination and wisdom and so on. So when Jesus talks about yoke, he's really tapping into a universal spiritual tradition. We don't know if Jesus knew anything about Buddhism and Hinduism, but it's likely that he did, because there were thriving Buddhist and Hindu communities in Alexandria and Baghdad and in that part of the world in Jesus' time. So it's likely that a spiritual, philosophical guy like him would have crossed paths with these traditions, but again, we don't have any direct evidence about any of that. But it's a fascinating possibility. So there are two stories that you all know that really illustrate Jesus' conception of sin. I'll just name check them quickly. John 8:1, the story of the adulterous woman, the woman who's caught by the Pharisees in the very act of adultery, and they drag her to Jesus, and they say, "Jesus, the law of Moses says we must stone her. What do you say?" And they're testing Jesus to see if he's really a good Jew, let alone the Jewish Messiah. Because they know if he says, "Stone them," then he's obeying the law of Moses. If he says, "No, let's not stone them," then he's violating the law of Moses. They think they have him in a dilemma. Of course, he goes to the third option. Let those without sin throw the first stone, and everybody leaves. And he says to the woman, "Where do they all go?" And the woman says, "Oh, they all left." And then he says, "Well, then you should go too." So Jesus, of course, suggests with that story, and the prodigal son story too, you know that one as well, that the best way to deal with sin or with these past mistakes is just to drop them and come back to this present moment and live now in your next life, in your next moment, with a new conviction. What Christians call forgiveness, what Gandhi and what the Hindus call renunciation, what Buddhism calls non-attachment, to simply let into release this thing that happened that wasn't so great. So forgiveness then is not earned through penance, it is ever flowing. It is the condition of God consciousness moving through us. It is only to be received, accepted, allowed. You don't have to buy it. So for Jesus, the way to overcome sin, or the way to break free of these internal flaws, is by relinquishing our past, by letting go of our past and turning our attention to this now moment. And now we've all done stupid things. I have. I'd go into it, but this is being videotaped, and it's going to be on YouTube, and I don't want everybody to know, So I'm going to skip that part. But the past does not control the present. In fact, the past has no power. The past doesn't exist except as a thought that you're having in this present moment. There's no such thing as the past. It's an absolute ephemeral fabrication. And it has no power. And we can, only our thoughts about the past have power, and we can choose new thoughts. The picture that you took of a rattlesnake alongside the trail 11 years ago can't bite you now. It's just a picture. And yet we're so beautifully imaginative, aren't we? All of us here can recall a shameful moment in the past, a terrible mistake, a faux pas, a wrong word, a selfless action. And as we recall that, the white-hot heat of shame and embarrassment comes all up again as if we just did it a second ago. And we're just so incredibly powerful in our consciousness to attach to these things. As Wayne Dyer puts it, the wake does not drive the boat. The wake does not drive the boat. The wake is just what the boat left behind. We all know that foamy water isn't pushing the boat. So in Dyer's beautiful little metaphor, who I am in this now moment is not determined by the past. Stephen Mitchell puts it this way: for Jesus, there is no drama. The more we surrender, the more we are carried along in the current of God's love. We become like the lilies of the field, who do not toil and spin, yet are clothed in splendor beyond Solomon's. We become impartial and generous like God, who makes the sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain to the righteous and the unrighteous. Not that good and evil don't exist, says Mitchell, but when you see into the realm beyond good and evil, where everything is pure grace, we are much less likely to be caught up in our own judgments and moral categories, and more ready to experience every action as easy and natural. So what if we are not at war with ourselves? What if Paul's imagery has gotten us into a lot of trouble? I don't know if you remember that movie from a couple years ago, Cowboys versus Aliens, a spiritual classic along with The Secret. Maybe you remember the outlaw played by Daniel Craig. He goes to he has, of course, like all outlaws, a terrible past and lots of redemption to achieve. And he goes to the preacher, and the preacher says, "The Lord don't care who you were, son. He only cares about who you are." So there you are, sitting in the multiplex watching a hilariously fun movie about aliens attacking cowboys, and along comes a spiritual bomb. The Lord don't care who you were. He only cares about who you are. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. Mitchell goes on to say that, quote, sin and guilt are such terribly inefficient concepts in spiritual practice. Mostly dead weight, excrescences of the image of God as a harsh father. It is much simpler to see things done shoddily or harmfully as mistakes. grave mistakes perhaps, but actions arising out of our ignorance, greed, and hatred, and correctable, transformable with enough sincere effort. You know, in Buddhism, we don't talk about sin and righteousness. We talk about unskillful versus skillful. So-called evil people are simply a little bit incompetent at cultivating their own happiness and ours. So next time you're confronted with someone who is very challenging and very difficult, think of them as unskillful. And your heart begins to melt a little bit. And you see this angry, vindictive, hostile person in front of you as someone who is in themselves deeply wounded, deeply struggling, completely lost. They can't find any useful tools to deal with the turmoil within them, and so they're lashing out in all kinds of obnoxious ways, and you think, wow, this person really unskillful. And so there you have it, really, these two contrasting visions of sin and its repair, both found in the canonized text of the New Testament. So let's go one step further. You know, Paul's violent dualism, good versus evil, where we are to combat sin, and Jesus' much gentler path, where we are to let sin fall away. So those are the contrasts. You know, Paul's portrait of our struggle against sin is a war, and Jesus is suggesting that we just let sin drop and fall away. How do we put these together? Because maybe there's a way. I'm not here to say that Paul is wrong and Jesus is right. That would be too easy. It's richer to go deeper. So despite all of his violent language, guess what? For Paul, the only way to overcome sin is by letting it go. Is by surrendering to the grace of God. Now, as a theist who believes in an external, personified, transcendent God, Paul believes you have to get on your knees, admit your sinfulness, and then the deity will lift out of you this sinfulness through the grace of God and the death of Christ. And, you know, the whole traditional Christian thing, all that theology, that beautiful story. And that surrendering is something Paul calls faith. You have to have faith. And a faith that has nothing to do with understanding. He says, don't try to figure it out, just have faith. And Paul essentially admits that all of the struggle that he's advocating is actually futile. It's kind of funny. He's talking about fighting, and then he admits at the end, you know what, the fighting doesn't work. Give up. So Paul is, in the end, probably a really good student of Jesus. In undermining his own portrait, Paul gives us a door to the same kind of surrendered consciousness that Jesus seems to advocate. So in the end, it's only through surrender that any of this is going to work. Renunciation, non-attachment. By letting go of the struggle, that only then can we begin to realign our thoughts and our words and our actions in harmony with our divine inner nature. And that's probably why Paul is not so far away from Jesus in the end. So at this fork, there's an interesting fork in the road, though. You know, traditional Christianity went one way, and New Thought went another. Many branches on the tree of traditional mainstream Christianity emphasize, of course, the dualism of good and evil, and the war, and that you have to pick, and you can't serve two masters, and all of that. And they emphasize our sinful nature, our wretchedness, and our need for salvation. Whereas in New Thought, of course, we emphasize Jesus' portrait of sin as an error corrected by relinquishing control, letting go of control, and returning to our innate goodness, that there is only one power and presence, and our life is, in fact, God's life. So one thing's clear. We cannot repair sin by mastering it, by muscling it to the ground, by controlling it, or by willfully correcting it. It cannot be squashed like a bug. That's why our friends in the recovery movement talk about surrender so much. And the first step, of course, is the admission of powerlessness. This same spiritual dynamic is woven through all of the wisdom traditions of the world. How ironic and what a delicious paradox that the mind will never understand, that it is only through the admission of powerlessness that we regain power. It is a secret only those who experience it know. Because on the surface, it's just plain illogical Poppycock. What? Admit powerlessness and get power? No, I'm just going to hold on to power. Okay. Keep trying that. So in the consciousness of loving kindness, we move beyond sin and into the realm of grace. Because in some ways, these internal flaws will always be with us. Why do we demand that we be perfect? Flawless in every word, every decision, every perception, every apprehension, every whim, every opinion, be perfect. Where did we get that idea, So growing wise means learning to accept our limitations and thereby growing more merciful and forgiving toward the limitations of others. When we accept our own flaws, we become accepting of the flaws of others. And perhaps, as Jung and many others pointed out, our constant judgment of others is really a projection of our self-loathing, of our own rejection of ourselves. And so we see in others all kinds of harm that we really detest in ourselves. So this self-forgiveness is a crucial first step to the forgiveness of anyone else. So on all of our spiritual paths, it's time maybe that we jettison the whole idea of struggle. Instead, let's gracefully and easily let go of habits that no longer serve our highest good, the letting go piece. And let us be courageous enough and bold enough to take Jesus at his word, that the true path is easy. Enough of this, spirituality as this, muscular, disciplined, arduous, agonizing process. What if that's just the wrong portrait? What if it's easy? What if the true path is easy? Far easier than struggling through the briars and brambles of our ego drama. That's hard. That's why Jesus puts it that way. He says, you've already got a yoke on, believe me. Try my yoke, it's easy. Your yoke is hard. The yoke of thinking that you're in control. The yoke of trying to muscle all your internal flaws to the ground and control them. That's hard. The yoke of surrender is easy. So this week, let's make it a little practice. Let go of some struggles. I don't know if it's bad eating, internet porn, pathological spending, and maybe there's an emotional affair that you're letting percolate at work just because you're bored. Those are difficult yokes to bear. Destructive, compulsive, unconscious behaviors driven by fear, unacknowledged needs. That's where all the bad stuff comes from. What if we just let all of that go to move out of the cycle of shame and guilt and simply let the whole drama drop away like the spent stage of a Saturn V rocket? It's fueled and it drove us, but now we can just watch it fall away from us. It's no longer who we are. And move instead into the stream of your own best life. Now here's the really good news. You don't have to manage all of the details, and you don't have to understand how it works, and you don't have to know all the steps. Let the higher power show that to you. Let the light within you illuminate the path before you. You don't have to know what all of the 10,000 steps are. You just have to know what the next step is, and the next step, and the next step. Let it be that easy. This is something you can test for yourself, by the way. You don't need to hear it from me or any authorities or traditions. This is something you can test against your own experience. Let your inner experience of this truth be the final authority. Let this be God's life through you. Your life is the laboratory where all of these truth claims are tested. It isn't about believing things because somebody else said it. And I know that in this room we really understand that. We understand the spiritual life as a practical life of action, of decision, and of willingness. And we have felt, all of us, many times over, the validity of these claims in our own experience. So it's not about obedience to anything, but the truth. And out of the fertile fields of your own experience, this new life that your soul is asking for will begin to grow. deeply rooted in the real, and bearing fruit that will feed the whole world. That's the beautiful part. We're here to be an expression of the one. There must have been a reason that you were born. The universe needs your gifts to be given, to help fill one little niche of the whole. That's a powerful way to apprehend one's own life and to let go of this strange obsession with perfection. Maybe that's what we mean by the end of sin. Namaste. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.